Let's find Keith again. Where'd you go? There you are. Dr. Keith, good to see you, man.
Good to see you, Corey, as usual.
As usual, Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you and everybody else. Everybody's listening and everybody who listens to this recording.
Yeah, here we are in the first show of, geez, what year is it? I'm losing track. 2022. Whoa. We officially live in like the future. This is like, you know, we're already past the day in Back to the Future 3. Or Back to the Future 2, I'm sorry, where they go to the future. We're already past that. We're already past Blade Runner now. I think this is the year of like Soylent Green. I think Soylent Green takes place this year. So a little something to look forward to.
Hopefully that's organic.
it's
the new twist in the modern world is Soylent Green is now organic. Soylent Green. I remember the year 2000, we had a New Year's Eve party and my band played.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. We were the band. And I remember as the clock was striking 12, I was out on my porch and we put Layla on, which is the song that my wife and I did when we were playing with her. And I was just dancing. I remember that moment, dancing in the millennium, that was 22 years ago, Corey. My God.
Wow. I also have a vivid memory of that New Year's Eve. I was at a friend's house at a party, and at about 11:58 or so, we all went downstairs into the basement. And then right when the clock struck 12, I pulled the circuit breaker, so all the lights in the house went out. So everyone thought it was Y2K.
Great.
Yeah.
Practical jokes kind of suck, but that one is a pretty good one.
We had fun with that one.
That's a fun one.
Well, speaking of having fun, today we're going to talk about trauma.
Yeah,
that was a rough transition right there.
That was where it works.
No, but this is a theme that has come up very often in this show and in your many other shows. Some of the programs that you've done with Jeff Salzman. Oh, yeah. We actually have an entire practice on our Integral Life Practice platform that I'll point people to, which is your From Trauma to Transcendence ILP module, which is wonderful. People absolutely love that piece. We released that like 3 years ago, I think, and I still get feedback about how helpful that practice has been for people. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking this some more with you today, particularly now, Keith, because I think these days it sort of feels like there is just trauma in the field, right? I mean, I feel like that all of us have been sort of battered by this reality in various ways. I mean, whether it's things that are landing in your personal life or it's just paying attention to the world around us. I mean, everything has become so fragmented, so to the point of not even fragmented, it's become so dissociated, and there's so much fear in the water and so much just intensity at all times. The minute I wake up in the morning, first time I look at the news feed on my phone, it's just trauma. It's crazy. I mean, in many ways, I feel like we are living in the era of trauma. But I think one of the things we're going to talk about today is how not to sort of wallow, in that trauma, which is very, very, I think, tempting for all of us to do, but rather to find the opportunity to transmute this trauma into something like post-traumatic growth. Which is another theme that you and I have talked about previously in the show. So all which is to say, I am really looking forward to getting into this with you today.
Great. Me too. And specifically, one of the reasons I wanted to do this particular topic is that there's an explosion of research and treatment modes around trauma that have occurred over the last 30 years. And there's these great systems for working with trauma. And I've studied a bunch of them and generated a couple myself. And one thing that I've noticed, and this is a typical integral critique of everything, that trauma, working with the trauma proceeds through stages, and at least 4. And what happens is somebody's treatment mode will privilege one of those stages And they'll go, hey, this works really well, which it does. And they'll go, well, this is the treatment for trauma. And then somebody else will have a mode that the privileges another. I'll give you a short example. I'll get into more detail later. In the first stage of working with trauma, it's important to recognize we're being influenced by traumatic learning in the present moment, and to find a way of looking at finding the original learning that caused us to have the non-adaptive responses, which is what trauma is. So you want to focus on the trauma and you want to experience it in effectively tolerable doses if you're doing therapy with somebody, with a therapist who can do that with you. So you want to focus on the trauma. When you get to the third stage of working with trauma, when you work through episodes and you've worked through the autobiographical narratives adjustments, when you begin to have a trauma restimulation, you do the exact opposite. You begin to feel the triggering event, and rather than try to figure it out, you just turn towards direct your attention towards a state that is more positive and pleasurable and useful state. You focus away from the event. Okay? Now, there's lots of systems that work with both of these systems, both of these stages. And generally, when people work through trauma, they need to go through all the stages. I'll talk about that in just a second. But first of all, let's look at what is trauma. Okay, trauma is a form of memory. Okay? We have, as humans, one of the things that characterizes us around different from all the other creatures is we have ridiculously enhanced memorial capacities. We got short-term memory, we got long-term memory, we got consolidated memory, we have implicit memory, we have explicit memory, episodic memory, procedural memory.
And that's just in the individual. We also have cultural memory.
Cultural memory, relational memory. There's and all these things affect our sense of self, how we move through the world, because that's what memories do. The nervous system is programmed to learn things so they can anticipate and associate on stuff in the present moment and then send us unconscious material from our shadow to guide us. Okay. And so what trauma memory is something happened in terms of our learning, either by a series of repetitive, distressing events of abuse or neglect of some sort. And by the way, these events are not categorized by the event. They're categorized by how somebody absorbs the event in their nervous system. So the nervous system, these are called in EMDR, Francine Shapiro's system. If there's a lot of little events, just being distressed or pissed off or, put down, these are called small T traumas, okay? Where we just experience ourselves not being mirrored adequately as children or something. And then there's big T traumas, that assaults, car wrecks, that kind of stuff, that we have a memory process that brings those the solutions that our nervous system came to those events, dissociation, attack, amplification, those kinds of things, and gives us impulses to go to those solutions, and those solutions are maladaptive. And with trauma, you get less resilient as you progress.
Right.
It takes less and less of a trigger to stimulate more and more of a response, and this is called sensitization. And sensitization is probably the dynamic that is most difficult and most pernicious in traumatic learning and in working with trauma. Okay? Now, that's a form of memory. There's another form of memory that is resilience, which is the exact opposite. Resilience is we have an unfortunate experience, but we learn from that experience, and the next time a similar thing happens, we are less distressed and more able to deal with it. And what we want to do when we have traumatic learning is we want to transform it from trauma memories, trauma learning, trauma reactions in the present moment into resilience. And that's trauma into transcendence, which is the working title of a book I've been writing the last couple of years on trauma. About halfway done with that book. Now, let me give you an example. So say there's a 6-year-old kid who goes to a soccer game and he loses and he throws a big tantrum. So his parents, being good parents, they want to help. So they take him aside and they start trying to talk to him, which, by the way, is not a good idea with a 6-year-old having a tantrum. He's not at this point being mirrored appropriately, in that he doesn't need them talking to him and explaining to him about being a good winner and that kind of stuff. But he keeps tantruming. It won't work. And then they try reasoning him, and then they get mad. They go, yeah, I have to stop. And he still doesn't come. And then they say, well, look, we'll give you an ice cream bar if you just shut up and go home, okay? He goes, all right. He gets an ice cream bar. Okay. So he's been totally reinforced for tantruming when he loses. So next week, he goes to the soccer game, loses again. I guess his team isn't very good. And he just throws a bigger tantrum, right? Okay, so they keep doing this. Okay, now what's happening, the traumatic event here is he's essentially being neglected because he needs a different kind of parental attention. He's not getting it, and he's become sensitized to losing, having a bigger and bigger reaction, and frustration. He can't tolerate it. 30 years later, he's with his lover, and she goes, I want to go to the movies tonight with my friend Jill. You know, we've made a plan. He goes, no, I want you to stay home with me. And she goes, no, I want to be with Jill. And he throws a tantrum and scares the hell out of her. Okay. All right. That's a traumatic learning from a series of small t events. Now, just to give this a happy ending, if this kid, the 6-year-old, has an identical twin who's being raised by, some kind of alternative universe by parents who know how to give him attention, he throws his temper tantrum and the parents go and say, you need a break. He goes, I don't want to break it, and he starts running away, and they grab him and they hold him firmly, but, with no judgment. And he's, let go. Look, when you come down and take your break, I'll let go. No, why are you doing that? I'm not going to talk to you while you're tantruming. Okay. Until you're after your break. Okay. No. Finally goes, okay, I'll sit still. Sit still for 2 minutes, and then let's go home. Okay. No moralizing, no lecturing, no other stuff like that. Okay, so the next week, same thing happens. He loses, throws a temper tantrum. Parents starts doing it. Parents says, look, you need a break. I don't want to break. But he doesn't run away. Look, I'm not going to talk to you until you take your 2-minute break. Okay, so he, after about 3 or 4 minutes, takes his 2-minute break. 2 months from then, he does the same thing. They go, you need a break. He says, okay, and he's quiet for 2 minutes. A year later, he loses. He goes, yeah, okay. 30 years later, he's with his girlfriend. I want to go with Jill to the movies. I wanted you to stay home. I'm disappointed, but that's okay. I want you to have fun with Jill. Okay. Bam, 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 bam. In that case, he had the appropriate attention. He developed resilience. Right. First kid developed trauma learning. Now, you can also have PTSD reactions from one big traumatic event. Mm-hmm. When I was 19, I had the misfortune of being at the wrong place at the wrong time and having a couple of police officers draw guns and throw me in jail.
Yikes.
Yeah, it was a big misunderstanding and the case was dismissed.
That's intense, though.
Yeah, it's a long, interesting story, at least interesting to me. But for the year after, whenever I got in an elevator with somebody, I'd imagine them pulling a gun on me. And I just break into a sweat.
Wow.
That one event had created this traumatic learning in me that I had to work on. And, which I did. And there's a lot of different forms of working on trauma. And one of them is exposure and response prevention. That's a cognitive behavioral. And I did that. I was 19, I was in a behavioral system, in UCSB. And I mean, look, these guys don't have guns, and if they do, they're not going to pull them on you. So just okay, Keith, you can do it. And I would do it. And I would look at the people, and I would be fine. And after a while, I stopped having that. So that's how we develop traumatic learning. And mostly, we're programmed to be resilient. 80% of the time, when people have a major trauma, I mean a big one, big car wreck, an assault, 80% of the time, they come through a little bit stronger than they did. Eventually, they learn from it. In one study in Australia, a bunch of 30-year-olds had had 4 big traumas on average before the age of 30. And mostly they were doing fine. So our nervous system wants resilience.
Yep.
We want transcendence, but we might get caught in this knot of habitual response where if we indulge it, where we just try to keep avoiding whatever it is, or try not to think, trying not to feel, trying not to do something, we get sensitized and there's less and less of a stimulus, has more and more of a response. And so that's not good. So we go see a therapist. Now, when we go to see a therapist, the integral therapist that they go see, because when we're doing our fantasy exercises here, we always do it with our imaginary integrally informed therapist. Integrally informed therapist knows that there's 4 stages of working on trauma. And what are those stages? Stage number 1 is something is not working for me in the present moment because there's situations where I'm not responding optimally. Why is it that when I get frustrated, I get super frustrated? Why is it I can't stop myself from screaming and yelling at people when they cut me off on the freeway? Why is it that when somebody gets mad at me, I kind of space out and can't think very, very fast? What's going on? Okay? That the present moment is not working. I'm not as responsive to it as I know I can be. And so you go to a therapist says, well, it sounds like there's some learning. Now, one of the most common ways of figuring this out is to go, well, when's the first time in your life you remember feeling this very sensation? You anchor the person in the sensations. We can all do this. Now, I don't want anybody to get all freaked out, okay? So if you start getting upset when you're doing this exercise, just stop, look at Corey and Keith in the video and go, I don't think I'm going to do this right now unless I have somebody else with me. But is there some situation where you reacted badly? Okay, I don't know, got too mad, didn't get mad enough, said yes when you wanted to say no, something like that. Just think about that. And all right, so remember how it felt when you did this thing. For instance, I had a client who didn't say no to a man until she was 28 years old. Why was that? She grew up in an abusive and emotionally abusive family. Everybody abused everybody except her. She didn't like to abuse people. So what she did is just said yes to everything. Yes, 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 yes. So dad and mom and sisters and brothers all abused each other. Her brother became an addict. And what she did is just said yes all the time. Turned into an intelligent and beautiful young woman. And intelligent, beautiful young women who can't say no get to be popular with people, guys, especially narcissists. And so, you can see how that played out until she was 28, and with some help from me and from others, she learned how to say no. Okay. So the point I'm making is that her trauma learning came from a solution to a problem that she had when she was a kid. So if you have a time when you're not acting well, upset, think about that feeling in your body. And when's the first time in your life that you felt that? Okay. What is that? Where were you? Who were you with? I remember being, I get a feeling, I made a scheduling error last week and felt ashamed. And I couldn't kind of let go of it. When's the first time I felt ashamed like that? I think, I think it was, let me see. I think it was this, first grade, told my teacher off because she was patronizing me. I got disciplined. I felt ashamed of myself. So you look back and go, okay, how was that reaction a solution at the time? Like with this woman, saying yes was a solution to her nervous system came up to a problem. You go, okay. Now, as you think about that feeling and feel it back then, you notice you're not being overwhelmed. And unless you are, then don't do this. No, kind of like Corey Keith. What we're creating is a form of dual focus, which is all trauma treatments have this, where you're able to identify that there is some kind of learning that bothered me, kind of figure out where it came from, what was the purpose of it, and so on. But be able to have some of that feeling, but also be in the present moment connected to someone you trust. Now, when you're doing this, what you're doing is you're activating your thalamus in your brain, which is part of your limbic system. This is the Dan Siegel thing. Okay, so this is a brain and the eyes are here. Okay, the frontal cortex, and then below the frontal cortex is the limbic area where relational stuff and emotional stuff happens. Well, the thalamus is the part of the limbic area that puts together stories of our lives. So as we're remembering this event, and as we're having some of the feelings, we're opening up that memory. And what we're doing is changing it. Because every time we have a memory, we're actually having a memory of the last time we remembered this thing. And as we look back at that and we're experiencing it in effectively tolerable doses, we're beginning to now think about that event and think about how it's affected us and thinking about how I might be acting in an inappropriate way in the present moment. And that might be coming from past learning and there's better ways of being. I'm doing that in a way where I can stay socially engaged. Okay? And this is the first stage of working with trauma. And for many years, a lot of people thought this is all you had to do. That's what Freud thought. Freud said, when you can tell the story without getting overwhelmed, then you've worked through trauma. As it turned out, Freud was wrong about that. Everybody loves finding areas where Freud was wrong, by the way. And why? It's like it makes you feel super cool when you're disagreeing with Freud. It's like, you know, like Newton said, you can't create or destroy energy. You know, energy cannot be, you know, matter cannot be created or destroyed. And we've discovered in an expanding universe that energy is being created all the time. Oh, I feel so smart disagreeing with Isaac Newton. Anyway.
Today's version of that is disagreeing with Fauci.
Yeah, right. Right. I disagree with Fauci in terms of his emphasis and some of his data. So anyway, that's the first stage. The second stage of working with trauma is what happened to me and how I reacted to it have become part of my autobiographical narrative. And we all carry around narratives of our lives centered in our right hemispheres. These are the stories of ourselves as children and teenagers and lovers and husbands and wives and sons and daughters and that kind of stuff. And the second stage is, so how did this learning and how do my current reactions to it, how does it affect the story of my life? How does it affect my autobiographical narrative? And how do I want it to affect the story of my life and my autobiographical narrative? What's a more beautiful, good, and true way of being affected by these previous experiences? We can't change what's happened, but we can change the meaning of them. And we do that all the time. And what happens when you're doing this work is you get to some point where you go, if I knew then what I know now, I would have behaved in a more adaptive fashion. And, you know, I'm a lucky person to be able to behave in a more adaptive fashion and to have more insight and more capacity now. And so we now have adjusted our autobiographical narrative to be a more positive narrative, where we're the hero in our own hero's journey, our own epic journey. And the experiences we have, even if they were humiliating assaults, were the trials and the tribulations and the ordeals that we had to endure and go through to become the person that we're becoming. Okay? And that's the second stage. And again, there's a lot of treatments that do this with people, and they're very effective. And they go, okay, well, now we've kind of worked through the trauma on this. But actually, we haven't. Because human nervous systems never give up behaviors and associations and action patterns that they associate with survival. So I still, when I'm driving and somebody does something dangerous that endangers me, might have a flood of rage and an impulse to punish this other person. I might feel that beginning, okay? That old response. It's currently maladaptive. Now, I don't want to really focus on where I learned that, and I don't particularly want to focus on what it means about my life. I don't want to surrender to that state. And so what I literally do is choose another state. How do I do that? Well, when I'm driving, I do loving kindness meditation. So instead of screaming at the person, I imagine my heart connected to his heart, usually, sometimes her heart, and go, may you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you have a useful life. My state changes and I shift. And so in that third stage, what you're doing is identifying these habitual states that are not particularly great states. Traumatized states are very, very hard on your body. I mean, one study of 14,000 veterans, they found that 3% of them had PTSD. Now, PTSD is a particularly pernicious form of trauma learning where you literally become non-functional when it's triggered. You can have flashbacks and nightmares and all kinds of things. And of the people that had PTSD, 60% of them had physiological problems, somatoform disorders. It's very hard on your body. Okay? And why? Because you're caught in these states that are high cortisol, lots of muscular tension, difficulty sleeping, eating and drugs and so on, or alcohol to try to change states. And so we want to shift from an unhealthy state to a healthy state in a healthy fashion. Box breathing is a good one. All the breathing techniques, yogic techniques, most contemplative practices develop enough of a witness so that we can see ourselves going into this place and then choose another state. Well, great. Well, now I've done stage one. I've been able to remember the trauma and understand the current learning and feel it without getting overwhelmed by it. I'm changed my autobiographical narrative to be more of a pro-social and heroic narrative in terms of my life. And I've learned how to choose different states when I get restimulated. But also, if we're continuing further, all psychotherapy and all change works develops some development of the witness. You know, I've talked about this a million times. So that witness is observing us all the time with compassion. Life being what it is, every once in a while, those three things aren't going to work. And we're going to have a disproportionate reaction or either too much or too little in some situation. And when that does, if you're invested in, well, I've worked through all my trauma stuff, it can't be trauma stuff, that's a problem. This is a big problem in the 70s. 70s, everybody thought that they could work through their stuff. Okay. I found that, to my credit, I found that hilarious in the 70s, and I find it hilarious today too. Nobody ever works through their stuff. So that fourth step is when something comes up, maybe there is a category of events or an event that when was the first time that I felt this? And how is that a solution? And how does that affect me now? I might go back to that first step. By the way, when people in a famous study, the adverse childhood event study that was done by Folletti and Anda a long time ago, it's the signature trauma study in the world. It's been quoted a lot by me and by other people. Just having doctors ask people about traumas and then on a questionnaire, and then the doctor saying, well, how do you think it affected you? The next year, everybody that they did that with had 17% fewer ER admissions and 33% less visits to the doctor.
Wow, just by asking the question.
And by the doctor saying, well, how do you think it affected you?
Yeah.
Just that had a huge impact.
Because it's giving them an opportunity to make, possibly for the very first time, a subject into object and look at it in sort of third person and interface with it in second person, which I imagine is tremendously cathartic for people.
If it's in a container of radical acceptance.
Yeah.
Okay. In that intersubjective container of radical acceptance. This is why in AA, the fourth and fifth steps are fearless. You take an inventory of all the things you screwed up, and then you go over that inventory with another human being in a container of radical acceptance. Okay. So maybe you have to go to the first. Maybe you have to go to the second step. Maybe you're still feeling like you're kind of a jerk person because you tended to be snotty to teachers and get thrown out of classes and feel superior to the other students and develop narcissistic wounds that you had to work with when you were 16 or 17, not to draw too much from Keith's history. And then concluded that you're kind of a dick on account of all that stuff, and then had to discover that you're actually a good guy that needed to work on that. What if that starts showing up again? Well, maybe I need to go back and go, okay, so where does my life story? Where am I not allowing myself to embrace the new life story?
Mm-hmm.
Or it just might be there's a habit of going into a distressed state, and I need to cultivate a new habit going into a more life-affirming or positive state. Now, what this does is all this whole thing is it basically normalizes the human experience. And this is a big deal. Unfortunately, over the last 100 years, psychology has pathologized pretty much everybody in the world. Now, that's not to say that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression and anxiety and eating disorders and all those horrible things that really cause a lot of pain and suffering and need a lot of attention, they don't exist. Of course, they exist. But it's a mistake to see any one of those, even schizophrenia, outside the realm of a developing human being that's on a path going through life, embedded in multiple cultures that are having a variety of effects. And that human being has a lot of power to make decisions. And those decisions, first of all, can be receiving influence, which is a huge decision. And when you're dealing with any of the diagnostic disorders in the DSM, any one of those, if somebody is willing to receive caring influence to address that condition, they'll do fine. Mm. So that's the human superpower of receiving positive influence. If you're willing to receive positive influence and then allow yourself to be co-directed with you and with someone that cares about you, your life course, and to begin to adjust things, people can grow and transcend. That's trauma into transcendence. And so all those diagnoses are helpful, but they're partial. And then behind the surface is this pathologization of the populace. Rather than, we need to have more of a focus on creating virtuous cultural containers and growth-oriented orientations developmentally.
Yeah.
So that it's not just cognitive development and learning how to read and write and all that stuff. Calculus, it's learning how to regulate affect. It's learning how to be a lover. It's learning how to have healthy relationships. It's learning how to understand trauma and to address it. That these are all, as we take this on and we have cultures that support that, people do really, really well. And indeed, and this is the data from the Adverse Childhood Events Study that studied, I think, 20,000 people and asked them about 10 different kinds of events. That data showed that people that didn't have major traumas did enormously well. And so, as I've been saying again for years, if we could just stop the big T traumas, neglect, abuse, that kind of stuff, yep. Amount of crime and amount of mental illness and amount of that kind of stuff would be reduced by 50% at least in one generation. So there's these 4 steps, and you can kind of take your trauma treatment, whatever one you like, and you kind of plug it in and you can see how it fits with one of these steps. EMDR, for instance, is really good and brain spotting and let me see, Dan Wolf's work, really good with being able to do the dual focus and experience the memory or the event without in affective tolerable doses so that you don't feel distressed by it. Narrative therapy is really good for the second, and Jungian therapy, really good for developing your life story, working on that part of trauma. Cognitive behavioral stuff, the tiny habits, BJ Fogg, really good about developing a third stage, developing new habits of consciousness. Heart math. Okay? And the 4th stage, of course, is understanding these systems and developing enough of a witness so that you can be aware when a defensive state is arising. Almost all defensive states have come from some kind of trauma programming, and then taking appropriate action. And so there you have it. Trauma, the 4 stages of trauma, an integral approach to this, because just in terms of stages, the principles hold true for every value beam. But of course, the motivation systems in every value beam are wildly different.
Right. Right.
That's okay. If your integrally informed therapist will let you know, if you're a red person, that you're doing this work so that you will be stronger and not be weak and be able to dominate your. If you're an amber person, you're going to be more in tune with, what would Jesus do? If you're an orange person, you're going to be more of a winner and less of a loser. And if you're a green person, you're going to be more in favor of everybody being cared about and not having be dominated by dominator hierarchies. And if you're an integral person, you're going, wow, this is interesting. I didn't know this. And then you move into, the next part of it. And there's, of course, blocks at every value beam. And there is resistance in our consciousness to look at traumatic events and traumatic programming. That's why when we're entering into the defensive state, when we're threatened and we want to go with an old solution that we programmed, our capacity for empathy and self-reflection plummets. And we have amplified or numbed emotions and these distorted perspectives, and then these destructive impulses to either collapse or attack or run. These are maladaptive in the present moment. And so you do the trauma work, that doesn't happen. Instead, you develop more and more resilience, and you react more and more effectively, serving the highest good, which is what psychotherapy is all about, which is what change work is all about, which is what contemplative work is all about.
Beautiful. No, very helpful. And I'm sure everyone watching right now is sort of feeling, at least I am personally, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but feeling a little bit of release around some of these. I'm personally speaking, I'm a trauma eating machine. I mean, all the major sort of important chapters of my life have been punctuated by periods of trauma, whether they're sort of the micro fractures that we've been talking about or the great big ones, right? That sort of, they sit with you for a while and they kind of change your very sort of constitution in a certain kind of way, from the inside out. So I want to talk about two kinds of trauma here. So I've got sort of two sets of questions for you here. And the first one I want to talk about is, because you're emphasizing how trauma is, it's linked to memory, right? I mean, it's a form of memory. It's sort of part of our process of remembering. And, Ken likes to point out remembering is literally to put back together again, to remember again. I've always really liked that. Now, this gets a little bit difficult for me when it comes to finding ways to get at and liberate some of the sort of, restricted energy, some of the restricted blood flow, it feels like, that comes with what I'll just call pre-verbal traumas. So traumas that occurred to you really before you started forming memories that you can now access as an adult. So for me, I'll put my own kind of skin in the game. I had two big pre-verbal traumas that I feel like absolutely shaped me into the person I am today, both for better and for worse. And one of them was, I feel like the big one was I'm an only child, but when I was born, I had a twin sister who was stillborn.
Oh,
so that has had, I think I can trace a lot of sort of my own anxieties that have sort of just always been there as background radiation. It feels like I can track it back sort of to that, in the very first months of my formation, I shared a space with someone and being an only child after that, I have always had this longing and fear for connection. All I want is connection. And the idea has always just absolutely terrified me. I want to be felt, but I want to hide. You know what I mean? So that's, I can track a lot of that to that, but it doesn't feel like there's much I can do with that because it all obviously happened. It's sort of encoded into my nervous system. I don't have a memory about it. I have stories that my mother has told me, for example, but I don't have a memory of losing my twin sister. The other sort of pre-verbal trauma, which is maybe a little bit lower scale, but I can feel it in my life just as much as when I was 9 months old, I got really, really bad food poisoning, had to go to the hospital, 104-degree fever, almost died, that whole thing. And as a result, at least my theory is, my narrative tells me, as a result, I have always in my life been a tremendously picky eater, and food elicits a disgust response for me very, very easily. right? So like I have sort of walled myself off from a lot of foods that most people I know just absolutely love. I don't like cheese. I don't like nuts. I don't like all, like, I'm very, very sort of picky about what I'm willing to put into my body. And I feel like that was another piece of that trauma, is when it happened when my parents were sort of getting ready for a divorce. Everything in my life as a baby was very chaotic. And I think I took that as like, I can't control anything out there. I can control what I put into my body. So that's where I'm going to sort of draw a line. And that line hasn't really moved very much in you know, the 44 years that have passed ever since. But I can feel how much of my story, how much of my, just the shape of my being really can sort of goes back to some of these pre-verbal traumas that I can't remember, but I can feel in my nervous system. And I've had my own ways of sort of dealing with those, transcending them, turning them into tragic superhero origin stories, that sort of thing. I've found my ways to cope. But I'm curious, sort of, if I was in front of you in a therapeutic setting, how would you help me or someone in our audience who also feels, some of these pre-verbal traumas that they don't have a memory associated with it, but it's still very, very much in their system. It's in their bones almost.
Okay, well, we can't like do 4 or 5 therapy sessions.
Yeah, no, and I'm not asking for that.
From this. I know, but I'm just saying. So I'm going to speed through some stuff that if you and I are hanging out, if you were my client and I was working with you on this,
mm-hmm.
we would do it in a more relaxed fashion. Okay. First of all, we begin to have what's called implicit memories in the 3rd trimester. And also, what are implicit memories? Implicit memories are action tendencies, associations, emotions that happen, and they're actually memories, but they don't feel like something's being remembered. And if you had a mother in the last trimester that got super upset and didn't know how to calm herself down, when you're born, you're not as good at affect regulation as kids that were with a mother who was able to calm herself down, because 30% of cortisol passes through the placenta into the infant. Okay, so those implicit memories are happening all the time, but they're the only memories we have for a long period of time, until around 18 months, when a hippocampus comes online. This is an important organ in the limbic area, right there next to the amygdala, where we can have memories that feel like memories. Okay. So you have implicit memories of distress. Also, just as an aside, you probably have some of your sister's tissues in your body. Chimerism is incredibly common. And if you're a twin, that means that one of your kidneys might have her genetic signature and not yours.
Interesting.
If you died, and I hope we never find this out, and they did genetic analysis of the tissues in your body, there would be tissues in your brain in different parts of your body that would actually have her genetic signature and not yours. If she was a fraternal twin. And even if she's an identical twin, we have some of that with our mothers also. So all that being said, knowing about this stuff, we move into the present moment, because trauma isn't about stuff that happened in the past. Trauma is all about the present moment. Right. We are not optimal in the present moment.
Yep.
So when we're dealing with the present moment, 2 things. One thing is, and this is going back to what you and Bina did with polarities, which is kind of cool. Mm-hmm. One thing that you do is you look at, all right, I have this thing about being connected and disconnected, being connected, disconnected, and it's kind of rough. It's not a smooth connection-disconnection rhythm, okay? And so probably what you want is a smoother connection-disconnection rhythm. You don't want unhealthy connections to feel good. No, they're unhealthy, or unhealthy disconnections to feel good. No. Mm-hmm. I want a smoother rhythm. Okay. So now, as I say this, I want a smoother rhythm of my connection, disconnection, of belonging, not belonging. As I say this, what are you feeling in your body?
there's sort of a placid okayness that actually kind of sets in. Like I can feel, I mean, I can feel sort of the smoothness that I've been able to sort of discover for myself. You know, I found my own ways to sort of work with some of this, and that really accurately describes, I think, the feeling tone that comes with some of that work that I've done, some of the progress that I've made, you know, over the decades in dealing with that kind of trauma. So there's a part of me that can kind of relax when I hear that. Even, you know, it's sort of like your earlier example when the doctor simply asks, "How do you think this, you know, this has changed you?" Simply asking the question brings almost a validation in a certain kind of way, and it brings like a sense that there's ground under my feet, maybe in a certain kind of way. Like this healing path I'm on, I'm really not making it up as I go. There really is something sort of fundamentally there.
Yeah. And so that feeling is your nervous system saying, yeah, I want that smooth connection. It's not that I don't want disconnection to feel fine all the time or not fine, or connection. I want that rhythm, that core rhythm of connection, disconnection, and feeling securely embedded in different cultures. I want that to be smoother. Okay. Now, the fact that you feel good about that means that your unconscious is going, yeah, I want that. I like that.
Yep.
Okay, so that moves us into the 3 stages. You know, if we were going to do the work together, are there events that are associated with unpleasant disconnection, unpleasant connection, or a sense of being alienated from a culture? And, you know, what was the reaction? You know, you're talking about your reaction as anxiety. Well, anxiety is very adaptive to a kid that's not feeling safe in these kinds of situations. It makes him vigilant, you know, and it makes him self-protective. All right. So that anxiety, that vigilance and self-protectiveness was your nervous system's response to not feeling securely in these particular environments. As you begin, so that's the first stage. As we begin to get to the second stage, you go, well, then my story is going from having that be jagged and not feeling secure to having that be more smooth and feeling more secure. Okay. Which brings us to the third stage of, well, what are the practices of cultivating that sense of smooth transition, from connection to disconnection, discerning healthy and unhealthy, and then choosing healthy when unhealthy shows up? What are those practices? Well, I've got some, and here's some others. Okay? And so it leads us in that direction. Now, the food thing is a little different. Okay? You're describing sensitization. And by the way, this is quite powerful. Disgust is one of the latest maturing affects. Doesn't show up entirely until around 4 or 5. But it happened with you when you were really tiny, okay? And so it kind of happened to you kind of generically around food. It was like, food fucked me.
Right. Yeah. Food almost killed me. So now I've got a vendetta against food.
So food. So, you know, starting around 4 or 5, you started getting disgusted with any food that you thought might fuck you, you know?
Yep. You know what I've noticed, Keith? It's what I call the entropy foods, like cheese and mushrooms, anything that's like any food that's associated with like decay in some way.
Yeah, there you go.
You know what I mean? It's mostly those foods.
And one of the reasons we developed the affect of disgust originally in human experience, because we're omnivores, we had to have a system of telling us what was okay to eat and what wasn't. And the feeling of disgust is what taught us what was healthy and what was unhealthy, so that people that weren't going being omnivorous in a dangerous environment and eating castor beans and dropping dead. Okay. All right. So where that leads us, and you know, by the way, I have a phobia of mayonnaise, so I really totally understand.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I would not. If you gave me a big pot of something, and they said we put a tablespoon of mayonnaise in that salad, I couldn't eat it.
Wow. See, that's very similar.
It's identical. Yeah. And not only that, I have indulged my phobia of mayonnaise. So it's not just phobia anymore. It's actual hatred. You know, I found a bottle of mayonnaise in in the refrigerator a couple of 20 years ago. I just tossed it. It felt so good. So Becky came home. This is my mayonnaise. She likes it, right? She said, "What'd you put the mayonnaise in the trash for?" I said, "Well, I can't stand it. I got a phobia about it, and also I hate it." She said, "Well, that's just too fucking bad. I'm going to eat it." She set a good boundary. Yep. And so now I can stand watching people eat it. The only time I ever ate mayonnaise, this is going back to what to do about it, was when I was studying karate. I got my black belt, and I was one of the youngest people in the Southern California Karate Association at that time, at 19 to get his black belt. I mean, I had trained hard. I was a good student. So anyway, when we went to the party where all the new black belts were, Mr. Oshima, the head of the school, came up to me with this plate of sandwiches. They had mayonnaise in them. He says, "Here, my wife made them. Eat." So I said, "I don't know, eat." So he waited. He wanted to see me eat it. So anyway, okay. That was really good, Mr. Oshima. It's the only time I've ever done it. It's like I was just gonna, I would, if he asked me to try to walk on water, I would have tried to do that too. It would have been probably easier than trying to eat that sandwich. So anyway, what you do with something like that is you go two things. One, you want to engage in activities that leave you feeling healthy in your GI tract, and that's a whole set of things. And you get data about that. I mean, this is the scientific part, good biome, microbiome, all that. And then the second thing is there anything that I really want to be able to eat? If you want to be able to eat cashews, all right, well, I mean, for some reason. Well, then there are methods of learning how to eat cashews. The most common one would, in this case, would be an OCD treatment called exposure and response prevention.
Yep.
But you can do other things too. Okay. You might not want to stop being a picky eater. I mean, I'm really picky. I want everything to be organic. I don't want to eat any glyphosate or anything. I want my grass-fed, meat and my northern salmon, cold. I don't want minimum mercury and stuff. But you might be able to then shift your decisions into conscious decisions rather than disgust-driven decisions. And the disgust affect is very interesting that way because we also learn how to have moral disgust.
Right.
Moral disgust is a huge big deal that you and I talked about when we talked about the 6 moral foundations.
Yep.
And then they all get scrambled together, which is okay. So say my tradition says you can't eat pork, and I see this other person eating pork. Okay, now I'm making a moral judgment about this other person. I mean, it's just interesting the way that they all get scrambled together.
Yep. Yep.
And so what you do is focus on being a healthier eater and a happier eater.
Yeah.
And begin to develop the capacities that you want. And if you don't want the capacity, okay.
Well, that's the funny thing is that there sort of is different levels of urgency when it comes to dealing with these different kind of traumas. You know what I mean? Like the disconnect one. I mean, that one has always been very urgent for me because that's like just a primal source of happiness and connection and belongingness and all that. So that's obviously something I just have been unconsciously kind of coping with for decades. The food thing is kind of like, well, choose your battles a little bit, buddy. You know what I mean? Like you're not gonna cure all your traumas, in a lifetime, maybe next lifetime. But if I have enough variance in the things that I'm okay with eating that I haven't really had to push too hard on that line in order for me to feel happy and healthy and all that. But it's interesting, kind of like your mayonnaise story and taking that bite of the sandwich. My version of that was I was about 10 years old and I went to, I used to take all the cheese off of my pizza and then put all like the pepperonis back on. My stepdad at the time absolutely hated this and would make me eat in the other room. So he would try to shame me by making me eat in the other room. He's like, this is not how human beings eat pizza. And I didn't care. That's my dad telling me that. Whatever, dude, I'll eat by myself in the other room. Totally fine with me. But then I was invited to dinner at a friend's house and they were having pizza. Right. And I remember, I was 10 years old. I remember being so stressed out about going to this dinner because I don't want to be embarrassed by taking pizza off all those things my dad was trying to embarrass me about. Now I felt the embarrassment because I was in a different context. Right. And so I ate the pizza cheese. And the funny thing is, I've been eating pizza cheese on every single pizza ever since then. Like healthy shame kind of put this trauma in its place for me. And I was able to move on, at least with that little, tiny bit of it.
Well, to draw from one of my books, that's the gift of shame.
That's right.
Shame is like all the affects. They're all there to help us out.
Yep.
Okay. And the other part of this, that's a big deal part. And I'm glad you brought this part of it up. An enormous amount of trauma learning happens in relationship. It happens in the lower left.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the lower right can institutionalize trauma, and it can institutionalize humiliation, and it does all the time. And you can see it in every value meme. There are structures that support humiliating people that aren't conforming to the values of that value meme. I always try to find where is that an integral, but I don't want to go down that particular rabbit hole. All of that stuff involves a subjective sense of being observed by a group that I want to be accepted by, and that they might reject me. And this causes an endless amount of problems. Okay. Now, development involves, if we're moving in a vertical direction, it involves progressively more radical acceptance of self and others. And where that begins to enter in dealing with trauma is that first level of recognizing that there's a problem, right, and then having radical acceptance of the fact that it's there, that it served a purpose, that it's part of who I am. And then running that off of the deeper waters. I think that all of us have a wise self that starts very, very, very young. I believe that it's constellated at 3 or 4 on some level. And that's not to say that you can access that in 3 or 4 or 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. If they're like the story I told about the kid, they during a temper tantrum, you don't access wise self from a temper tantrum right away.
Right.
But increasingly, when we can access that spot and say, okay, from that spot of radical observation and radical acceptance, what serves the highest good? And that's a through line. That's a through line horizontally and vertically. When I was listening to you and Bina talk about polarities, which is a fun talk, I recommend people listen to that if they want. Bina's a genius with this stuff.
It really is.
And she and Suzanne, their work is just fantastic. And I love both of them. If you're when you're moving forward, when you're looking at difference with polarities, she said, I don't like the word, what was it? Balance. And I was listening, I says, yeah, harmony is the word we're looking for. Okay. Health is harmony. So health and unhealth isn't particular, it sounds like a polarity, but really it's a description of polarities. Lack of health is I'm stuck in one end and not appropriately moving in the other direction. Mm-hmm. I'm not harmonious. Health is harmony. It's moving. Sometimes we're extremely assertive. Sometimes we're extremely not assertive. Sometimes we're extremely caring. Sometimes we're extremely self-focused. What's the harmony? The harmony is what serves the highest good. And the less ego we have involved and the less trauma learning we have involved, the more that we naturally stay present and move harmoniously from moment to moment to moment to moment. Okay? That's a through line around doing polarity thinking, doing the dialectic. That's a through line through various value beams. If you're asking yourself what serves the highest good, generally you're embodying the more healthy aspects of whatever value memes whatever altitudes you are at that time. And that's a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in that phrase, the highest good, because obviously goodness is something that is typically shared between people, right? That's right. It doesn't only come through you as an individual, it's shared. And this actually brings me to the second sort of set of questions. The second type of trauma I'd love to hear you speak on. And, I just want to acknowledge we wrapped an entire episode around this a year or so ago. But this is the question here is, how do we interface and metabolize traumas that don't originate within ourselves individually, but are sort of shared? And this includes any number of traumas. This can be generational traumas, where the memories from our parents and grandparents get passed down to us as narrative, and then that shapes how we think about reality. I think it's clear in the society we live today, we have inherited a ton of generational trauma, particularly around, racial relations, for example. We have unprocessed, undigested, unmetabolized trauma that in many ways has produced sort of a sense of guilt on this side of the fence and a sense of resentment on the other side of the fence. And it can be really, really difficult to work through that, especially when the conditions that created those traumas in the first place occurred generations ago, right? You can't go back. There's not a memory that we have of when this started and how life was different before. There's none of that. It's just sort of like we've inherited this mess and now we have to figure out what to do about it. So that's one kind of sort of shared trauma. There's also social traumas, right? You could point to 9/11 was a shared social sort of civilization-wide trauma. Hey, I considered January 6th the last year to be a trauma. That was a traumatic effect to see something like that unfold on national television. Be like, this is our country. This is you kind of, it lands in your sense of like American identity and all that. There's nothing for me to do personally to sort of solve that trauma other than metabolize my little piece of it. But sometimes, I guess where I'm going here is sometimes metabolizing your piece doesn't really move things in any meaningful way. And then another kind of trauma, which I actually emailed you about this week, was, and maybe we wrap a whole other show about this, but like the traumas, the accumulated traumas that we can find in any given lineage, right? Catholicism has a lineage of traumas. Buddhism has a lineage of traumas. Integral has a lineage of traumas. And one of the things I think is interesting is I can't remember ever having a conversation where we framed it like that, where we actually said, hey, let's look at some of the significant traumatic effects or influences or events that, have occurred within the integral lineage, and actually in sort of, sometimes insidious ways kind of recapitulate themselves. We've in some ways all in the integral space inherited some of these traumas, sometimes without even knowing it. So I think, that could include everything from Ken's experiences with Treya. That was a huge trauma in Ken's life that then, of course, is going to permeate all the rest of the work that he does afterwards. I wouldn't be surprised if we found out that some of Ken's appropriate, but, sometimes strong antipathy towards green, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if some of that came out of his experiences with Treya, some of the wonky diagnoses that, they would receive from green, etc. I could imagine something like that happening and then perfuming his work from that point on. And then we have traumas like, the various spiritual teachers who've come through here and have, totally morally bankrupted themselves and hurt the space. We have employees who, I've got one employee who committed suicide, another employee who died of a drug overdose. That's all part of this story of the integral lineage itself, which, again, whether or not people are aware of, they're part of that field. They're part of that sort of field of trauma in some sort of way. Then we can even talk about, Keith, your family has gone through traumas, which we've talked about in this show. My family with my daughter's medical journey, that was the most traumatic experience I've ever known in my life. And it informs my work. And then these people who are listening to us and watching us right now, they're part of that field. Congratulations, guys. You are now part of our trauma simply because we're able to talk about it sort of publicly and share the heart space and the healing that have come out of those kinds of trauma. So all of this sort of creates this shared field of trauma where no individual alone can possibly metabolize it or let alone fix it. I mean, I don't know if we ever quote unquote fix these things, but it can be difficult to know how to move forward together when all we're left with is sort of individual methodologies and practices and techniques to kind of, process our piece of it. It reminds me again of the doctor who's simply asking, how has this affected you? It feels like maybe one of the things that we need here is we need to ask each other, how has this affected you? And let me tell you how this has affected me, and have an actual sharing of some of this trauma response. But how do we, is there a practice for that? Is there a methodology for processing these kinds of shared traumas between us?
Well, first of all, that's a pretty broad landscape that you just...
A little bit. Let's do another show on it right now, Keith.
Just to expand it a little bit further before we start contracting, there are morphic fields, I believe, of groups, of families. If anybody's ever done a Hellinger constellation, it's pretty amazing what comes through when you have somebody stand in for, my great-grandfather who died. Mm-hmm. There's the whole, one of the things I like about critical race theory is the understanding that our unconscious has been shaped by multiple generations of racists in this country. In that being able to courageously examine that is a path, not just towards social justice, but towards personal development.
Yep. Zone 4 stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Zone 4 stuff. And so I love that. Okay. But so first of all, there's all that. Yes. Those forces are all affecting us all the time and have affected us from the very beginning. Also remember, a trauma is whether we become more resilient as a result or whether we become more sensitized is a choice our nervous system makes. Our adaptive unconscious, what I call our shadow selves. And so part of it is just beginning to understand where from all this stuff have I become more adaptive, when have I become more resilient? Mm-hmm. I personally think that if there are past lives or however, that there was an awful lot of trauma that whatever my spirit was experienced, particularly given my predilection to martial arts, around conflict and violence. And so there's a part of me that has become very, very resilient about violence. Mm. And it was something I was drawn to, okay? To understanding, to metabolizing in a particular way. And I had some capacities there. And so it's not all negative, okay? It's also, where have I become wiser? Where have I become more resilient? Now, this brings us now to what you were talking about with the integral community and other communities and so on. And this reminds me of something that Ken was going through a list of problems, and he said, well, the answer to this problem is wake up. The answer to this problem is wake up. The answer to this problem is wake up. The answer it's for me, one of the things that happens in loving cultural containers is that there's a sense of enduring, a sense of indefinite enduring of, that's not how social containers work. Right. Social containers are safe and nourishing in our growth hierarchies when they are, and then they're dominator hierarchies and they're not safe when they're not. Mm-hmm. Every institution has, because of humans' capacities for wanting position on social hierarchies and of social competition and so on, every institution has a certain amount of corruption that always arises in it, everyone. Yep. And so what you want with an institution is you want some kind of interior regulatory capacities that is just continuing to minimize the corruption rather than indulge the corruption. And the tendency that we have in terms of moral discernment, and this is one way you can influence people, and we talked about this last time, we tend to, because we have negativity bias, we'll tend to dismiss a person or a group or an institution because of one negative thing. Mm-hmm. So if we've woken up to that fact, to that capacity, then what we do is we see all institutions as corrupt, all institutions as wanting to not be corrupt. And then what we see is there's some institutions that are better at self-examining and self-correcting, and some institutions that are worse. The ones that are better can keep the level of corruption at manageable levels, and the institutions can actually mature. The forum is one of those things. As far as I can tell, they've been able to continue and even to grow and to not become more corrupt. The things that you were talking about in the integral community, I know that for me and for my fellow integral compatriots, it did make us feel a sense of rejection of the integral container. It made us more wise about personal responsibility.
For sure.
It certainly made us way more wise about guru yoga.
Right.
I mean, I suspect that the whole guru yoga thing goes back thousands of years. Certainly, that's one of the problems with the Catholic Church. But then, Martin Luther did all his stuff. And then you start having guru yoga happening with the Protestants. I mean, it's just those systems did not have regulatory capacities to self-regulate the corruption of guru yoga. Okay, well, integral does now.
Right.
Way better than it did before.
Oh yeah, no, we've grown. We've grown. I mean,
Okay.
one of our responses to these kinds of traumas, for example, Keith, is to launch this very show. I mean, I remember when you and I were first talking about doing this show together, this is how it lined up for me. I was like, this is going to be sort of the channel, the vehicle through which we can start processing some of this together, right? Where we can sort of, where integral, not just integral minds, but integral hearts can come together and just hold the weight and the gravity of being integral together in this world and what that means, and the types of pressures and pains and opportunities and growth and awakening that comes out of that when we can actually hold this together. So this very show was in a certain direct way a response to exactly these kinds of traumas.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you and I have done, and I've done this with Jeff too, and Shrink and Pundit, is whenever there's an issue, we've dived into it and looked for where are the opportunities for more beauty, truth, and goodness.
That's right.
And also, whenever we see a problem, we dive into the problem and go, where does this problem reside in me? Right. Because as Walt Whitman said, we contain multitudes.
Yeah.
Whatever kind of fucked up thing there is in the world, there's some part of Keith that goes, I'm down with that. Okay, well, my job is to regulate all those Keiths so they can be part of the choir and sing along, but not have them dominate. Because if I let one of them dominate, then I would do something corrupt.
Right.
And I don't want to.
Right.
Now, if you notice what we're talking about now is flex flow.
Yeah.
Leadership. Flex flow leadership recognizes leadership when it's when someone is providing appropriate leadership in a flex flow system. The other people go, okay, you're in charge. And when somebody else, when my leadership is being challenged by my own interior or somebody else's trauma stuff, flex flow leadership as well. I'm kind of suspicious of myself now. I need some help. Great example of this is not doing therapy with family members. Great example of this. I don't care who you are. Okay, and I take great pride and pleasure in my capacities as a psychotherapist, given that I just maniacally have dedicated myself to it for 50, 60 years now. And with a family member, no way.
Right.
People have to say, Keith, Dad, what do you think? And I go, okay, you just asked me what I thought. And I'm going to tell you. But if you don't like it, fine. If you don't think it's right, that's fine.
Yeah.
It's all fine. Okay. But am I going to volunteer an analysis or a confrontation or anything? What does therapy do? Therapy, you relate, teach, inspire, confront, interpret, and direct. Okay. So I relate with my family, and I don't do any of those other things unless I'm invited. None of them. That's a good example. You know your limitations. And you go, okay, this is synoptic empiricism. We also kind of look for the people that we trust. What do they think? I trust your judgment. So if you and I were talking about something and you had some doubts, I would say I need to process further. I trust Roger Walsh. Roger Walsh, I love that he writes about wisdom because he's one of the wiser people that I've encountered in Integral.
100% agree. He is one of my all-time favorite human beings.
Yeah, so if Roger Walsh disagreed with something, I go, okay, at least for now, for the time being, I'm going to kind of process further until Roger says, no, I begin to feel better to me. I feel that way about a lot of people. I feel that way about Jeff and about Diane. I mean, I don't want anybody to feel left out, but yeah, there's that. And that's what Sangha does for us.
Yeah.
And just like in an integral Sangha with a flex flow dynamic, some of us have more expertise in some areas and some of us have more expertise in other areas, and it goes like that. So for me, it's an emergent quality. And now I have one last thing to say about this. When I've noticed, when I've gone around the world and taught and stuff, or in the United States, when I'm talking to someone who's operating at an integral altitude on their moral line, their self line, their cognitive line, it's like, and it doesn't matter whether English is their second or third language either. It doesn't even matter if they speak English. And if I'm talking through an interpreter, all of a sudden we feel like tribal members together. It's an amazing experience. It's an instant intimacy that happens. And this is the integral awakening that's happening around the world. And it's so pervasive. I think people are having difficulty recognizing it. Now, it's not really organized because there might be, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a few people in some institution. The thing that was most characteristic of people coming to Integral and Boulder is that everyone had felt so alone before.
Yes. Yeah.
And they go, no, I don't feel alone anymore. Okay,
right.
Of the three jewels, I think Sangha is probably the most beautiful of the three jewels. Because, there's lots of different dharmas that are effective dharmas. And there's lots of bodhisattvas that have existed and that exist today in the world. But Sangha is a quality of being with like-minded people who can love you for who you are, not in spite of who you are. That is kind of a qualitative experience that we crave and that we suffer when we don't have. Yeah. It really goes back all the way to purple, all the way to infrared, to tribal. And so what I want to do, and I encourage other people, is I want to feel those rhythms. And there's a lot of currents happening. And I just want to be in harmony with them and be in harmony with Keith's incarnation. There's a memorial for Terry this coming Saturday that I'm looking forward to. And it reminds me of Terry's and my Beyond Awakening talk, where his incarnation pushed him towards larger social action. Yep. Particularly the climate. And my incarnation is pushing me more towards this work that we're doing today in my psychotherapy. And basically we were talking about how there's kind of a subtle identification with your own work that you go, mine's superior. And we were kind of examining that together. Well, actually all the work fits together. My job is, how does my work fit with yours? And how does yours fit with mine? And how does mine fit with the deeper voices in my wise self, in my incarnation, and maybe from previous generations? I mean, my grandfather was a warrior in World War I, and saw a lot of action. It was a horrible war, and he did this thing. But there's something about his spirit that's come through to me. But one thing that came out of it was just this incredible, profound distaste for violence. I mean, I have known from my earliest days that it's toxic. Talk about resilience. Guys who are just deployed to wars, when they come back, their brains have been degraded. For every deployment, for every other deployment you have less capacity in your frontal cortex and more sensitization in your occipital cortex around the sensory areas. I mean, there's something really horrible about people doing violence to other people. That's a lot worse than random, tornadoes and stuff. Okay. There's something wrong with that. There's something that goes against some basic, deep, heartfelt drive for unity that all of us know is valid. And even the people who don't do it will talk about it as if they're yearning for it. They're trying to find a way through it through their violent bullshit.
Yeah.
And that's what the integral ageism is blossoming. That's where the implicit is becoming explicit. This is where the object is becoming subject. This is where we are all, many of us, the world-centric people, we're identifying with everybody, especially now, with all this stuff that's going on in the United States, fucking United States, all racist. Now we got all these fascist bullshit, and, people competing online and, trying to make money and the pharmaceutical, just what a mess. Yeah. And so I'm not in any kind of love it or leave it mode with the United States. I'm kind of identifying with everybody in the world trying to deal with this mess and going, on the other side of it, hopefully everybody will be a lot more world-centric, seeing as we're all taking a shot together.
Yeah.
And, the thing about being an American isn't like I'm super proud to be an American. The thing about being American is I have more responsibility to heal this culture than I do the others because I'm a member of this culture.
Yeah.
So it's about my responsibilities to try to make things better. And I'm doing the best I can. But, there's my answer to your inquiry. That's my initial response.
It's a beautiful, it's a wonderful answer. It's because again, it makes me feel the same thing I sort of talked about earlier, where it makes me feel like the ground underneath my feet are real, because I see so many of us on parallel paths, and not parallel in terms of, like you said, like Terry's karma led him in one direction, your karma led you in another direction. Some of that karma is in response to these innate traumas that we have felt in our lives, right? Of course. You felt a trauma around violence and conflict, and that actually pushed you into the sort of resilience that would allow you to become a tremendously skillful therapist that could help people with conflict and violence.
More often we find meaning following our wounds than following our.
That's right. You step into the trauma.
To those things,
Yeah.
Well, it's not. Bill Hanlon said this once. He said, "You find meaning for pissed. What pisses me off enough to do something? Dist. Who told me that I couldn't do something that I want to do? Blissed. What makes me feel super great, and blessed. I had a guy tell me, you'd be a good therapist when I was 15 years old.
Right.
Okay. I was blessed by that. Okay.
Right. Yep.
So pissed, dist, blissed, and blessed. That leads us. And
tongue twister.
Yeah. Now, are there any questions? I mean, I don't know. We've talked a lot about this stuff. Does anybody have any questions you want to ask about?
Yeah. This? So if anyone has any questions, you can hit Q&A button, or you can press raise my hand and we will ask it on the show. While we wait, Keith, I just want to square that circle just by saying, one of the things I love is that you were able to pursue your path. Terry was able to pursue his path, both of which in certain ways were reactions to trauma, leaning into trauma. That's and for me, my own path has been, the thing we talked about earlier, the disconnect, reconnect sort of polarity has caused me, because of the sort of loneliness that I felt in my life, to want to create connective tissue for people like you and for like Terry and for our audience. And so that all of these stories could, sort of be shared, and that we could start building this more satisfying Sangha that is a little bit more resilient today than it was yesterday, because we're constantly learning from these experiences and leaning into our trauma individually and together. And that's what makes me feel blessed. That's my piece of that blessed tongue twister that you just shared with us. So let's see.
Well, I really like how you do it, Corey. And that's been your vision. You've been kind of driving this forward, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that. So let's see. I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay.
And that's fine.
Sure.
We said a lot. I'm checking on YouTube real quick. One person says, I think this is sweet. If I've inflicted trauma on someone who has developed a strong negative affect toward me, regardless of my positive development, how might I offer my support to that person's trauma resolution?
Oh, that's a sweet question. There's a reason that making amends is the eighth and ninth steps of Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step program. And making amends, it's interesting. I'm not in recovery, but I work with a lot of people in recovery, and certainly love the recovery movements. The reason for that is that you make amends to someone if you can do it without causing further harm. Okay, that's a very difficult discernment. If you created an injury and there's a possibility to make an amends, say I'm sorry or something, and it's not going to cause further damage, great, go for it. If it's going to cause further damage, then you're not doing it to help that other person. You're doing it to relieve your shame emotions, and go someplace else for that. Okay, but if it really is going to help them feel better, go for it. So that's my response to that.
Yeah, and we have a number. I just want to point folks to two things. So first, we have an episode of Art of Practice with myself and Lisa Frost, where we talk to Barbara Hunt about her forgiveness practice. And that's a powerful practice. I mean, I am more and more beginning to orient to forgiveness as a master practice, kind of like mindfulness can be seen as a master practice that sort of sits behind all of our other practices. It organizes all of our other practices. All of our practices are always being engaged in a mindful way. I think that forgiveness creates something similar. It's an ongoing sort of meta practice that we're always doing somewhere back here. And I really like how Barbara put it, because Keith, it actually sort of, it sounds like the opposite of what you're saying, but I think it's actually an agreement. It's just sort
very
of
much. For me, it's much easier to cultivate radical acceptance.
Yeah.
Radical acceptance.
Yeah.
Why? Because radical acceptance really is focusing on my own approach and my own attitude. And forgiveness is a slippery concept because it has a lot of different meanings to me.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure. Yeah.
So
So that's why I'm trying to focus on, and her name again, someone just asked, her name was Barbara Hunt.
Barbara Hunt.
Check it out in our archive. I read, her approach to it actually reminded me of Roger Walsh, because Roger Walsh, when he talks about selfless service, he frames it in an interesting way. He goes, it is beneficial to yourself. It is a selfish act to do selfless service because it makes you feel good. It makes you feel good. It creates pleasure. In your life, it creates dignity. It creates honor. It creates a good feeling for yourself to serve others selflessly. Barbara takes a similar approach to forgiveness. She goes, when you're forgiving another person, I mean, yeah, you're doing it kind of for their sake too, but what you're really doing is you're releasing this weight for yourself.
That's exactly right.
You realize you are the one who's been carrying. And whether or not the other person can even receive your forgiveness is almost irrelevant, because what you want to do is you want to unburden yourself.
And by the way, one of the signs that you have worked through traumatic events is when you either have forgiveness of the perpetrator or radical acceptance of the event, and radical acceptance of the perpetrator as an injured person who passed their injury on to you, which is another definition of forgiveness. And so not forgiving is swallowing poison to punish somebody else. We don't want to do that. Okay?
Right.
And so forgiveness, radical acceptance are often the end states of effective trauma work. And you can feel them at any one of the stages. That's the thing. I mean, the stages don't precede A, B, C, D, just like grief stages don't precede A, D. But they're definitely stages, and it tends to go in that direction. But any one of them can be enough. Any one of them can relate in these kinds of experiences.
We've got a couple more comments and questions if you're game.
Sure.
Get a few more minutes. All right. So let's
Sure.
see here. Well, Steve on YouTube just makes a comment. You know, it's a good conversation when you have to pause and pace every 30 seconds to let it metabolize. Thanks, fellas. Steve, I'm so glad this has been helpful for you. And it's a lot. I mean, that's kind of the thing with these shows is we pack a lot into these discussions. When we broadcast this on integrallife.com and post it there, that might be helpful because I tend to chop this up into sort of individual chapters and sections, and you can always revisit and sort of sit with any of the many, many, many topics that have come up here so far. But I'm really glad that this has been beneficial for you in some way. Let's see here in Zoom. Scott says, I like this comment a lot. Speaking of recovery trauma, I believe it's beneficial to say mindfully, I have an addiction rather than I am an addict. It gives distance and avoids a sense of death of self when one kills the addiction. Thoughts? I really like this because for me, this framing pulls me right into witness consciousness. It reminds me of some of Ken's writing where he says, we imagine that we are trapped in pain and are therefore subject to the slings and arrows of suffering and misfortune, but we are not in pain. Pain is in us. And with that reorientation, a new source of resilience and anti-fragility comes online almost automatically, simply by bringing in that sort of witness consciousness. I feel something very similar here when we're talking about addiction. What do you think, Keith?
I agree. You notice the difference between I have an addiction and I am an addict is the I that has an addiction is larger than the addiction.
Right.
You're speaking from the I.
That's right.
Now, but also it's taking responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I have an addiction that I need to be responsible for. And once again, the I have an addiction that I need to be responsible for. That I that's talking is the I. It's the witness. And when you talked about, I have some people I work with that are what's called in the program old timers, like they're 35, 40 years without a drink. And increasingly, and it's a spiritual program, the program goes to experiencing yourself as, I'm kind of the caretaker of this incarnation who has addiction and needs to be responsible for it, but also has responsibilities to carry the words on to other people and to continue fearless self exploration and growth. And being the I with the responsibilities of this incarnation is empowering and beautiful. Okay, so I very much agree with Scott on this, and I think that if you talk to people that are deep in the program, they'll say the same thing.
Do you think? Because this reminded me actually of the 3-2-1 process.
Mm-hmm.
It's reminding me of shadow work.
Oh yeah,
and it seems to me that there are maybe 3 different ways that we could frame this, and they're all sort of true as long as we're paying attention to who the I is and what the addiction is. But I mean, it feels to me saying like, I have an addiction. That's a great sort of almost third person kind of, you're making that subject object. You're looking at it in third person. I am with addiction is another one. That would be a more second person where it's almost like, this addiction and I kind of need to tangle a little bit, right? And then there's sort of, bringing that back into first person where it might not be I am an addict, but I struggle with addiction.
Well, and also let's deal with stages.
Yeah.
The most difficult step is the first step. My life's become unmanageable. In the first step, it's often useful to say, I'm an alcoholic. I'm an addict. It's useful to identify with the out of control identity and state. Right. Because then I'm out of control. Right. I'm an addict. I have to turn it over to other people who are instruments of God, because if I don't, I'm going to die.
Right.
Now, once you start receiving, once you start moving in that recovery direction, that opens you up more to I have an addiction. But sometimes I am an addict, I am an alcoholic is a necessary step at that particular stage of dealing with the trauma of addiction.
Yeah.
And I don't care how happy somebody looks. I don't care how Dean Martin you look with your alcoholism. You're traumatized by your addiction. It's hammering you every day. and causing all kinds of problems.
It's new traumas are coming out of it
Yeah.
all the time. It's not just a trauma in your past. It's an ongoing trauma.
Talk about shame. So this is why it's how it lands. It's what we need at the time to move to the next step.
Yeah.
It's all those things.
I feel like there's a danger in there too, Keith. If you only keep it as I have an addiction, I have a lot of addicts in my family, and I've known a lot of them who take on this almost self-defeating, their sense of I isn't strong enough to make the statement, I have an addiction, because what they end up doing is justifying their behaviors because they can see in third person that they have an addiction. This isn't me. This is just the addiction. And I have no choice in this.
Yeah, it's addiction talking.
Exactly. This is the addiction.
When I yelled at you and yeah, it was all me.
That's right. That wasn't me, guys. That was just that's right. And so there's a displacement. There's a dissociation that comes with that. So that's why I invited sort of like, maybe we actually can think about this in first, second, and third person simultaneously, so we can feel that energy kind of moving out and then back in again. And we can choose the best way to relate to it at a given time. Yeah.
And what do we agree on? We agree that harmony is better than disharmony. That growth is better than stagnation. That love is better than hate. The resolution and clean assertion is better than violence. I mean, they're orienting principles around all this. Right. And so one thing that I want to say about this, one thing I love about the talks that we do, the things that you and I do every month, is like, there's nothing that's more complicated in the known universe than being a human being relating with other human beings. There is no field that has so many nuances. There's no set of decision trees. It is not such an intricate forest. And one thing that I love about what you and I do is we get to kind of focus in on one aspect of it, or one general like corner of it, each month.
Yep.
And at least as a psychotherapist, that's a necessary thing to do psychotherapy. But at least as an integralist trying to move forward, I think it's beautiful to know that they're all happening all the time. And then every once in a while, there's like a little signal that says, maybe there's some trauma stuff happening that I need to work on. And by the way, there's 4 stages I can go through. Which stage do I need to lean into? That kind of stuff changes us.
Yes.
This is just like Integral does. It is a psychoactive system. We begin to feel like instruments of the larger I. Okay? Yes. And those instruments, what do we want to do? We want to help each other. And we want to receive each other's help. It's not just offering, it's receiving. And there's something very pleasurable about that.
Yes.
Just getting back to egocentrism, something really pleasurable about helping you and having you help me, Corey. Really pleasurable about, helping Ken and having Ken help me, and helping Scott and having Scott help me. There's something about that is part of something much larger and more beautiful than we can even imagine. And that's part of what this is all about. And the trauma part of it is an important one, because that's the part often that we don't want to look at. And we have to look at it to grow.
Yes. Beautifully said. I've always loved the self as instrument metaphor. I actually use that as sort of a tagline for Teal. I feel like at Teal, we really come to terms with self as instrument. Mm-hmm. And then at Turquoise, I often frame it as cosmos as symphony.
Yeah.
That's the point where we figure out how we've been tuning our instrument all throughout this Teal stage. Now, how do I play it along with the rest of this symphony? And I've always really loved that metaphor. And let me just reflect real quick as we're closing, Keith. I want to reflect some of this love back to you, and just why I love this show so much, both personally and impersonally. I think that particularly in the early days of Integral, when Ken was sort of, the mascot of Integral, there was this sense of what it meant to be an integral person. And in some ways, particularly because of any number of projections and golden shadows that we can put into this, it felt in a lot of ways unattainable, right? And for me, it took years and years for me to fully internalize the fact that there is no such thing as a fully formed integralist. No such thing. We are all works in progress. We are all poetry in motion. right? And that's one of the things I love about this show so much, is that the conversations are so naturally and easily and comfortably integral. I mean, in an hour and a half, we go through third person descriptions of some of these dynamics and the 4 stages that you just laid out. And then all of that is surrounded by this second person relationship that you and I have together, this deep trust, this love that, you know, I feel between us and between us and our audience. Right.
Yes.
And then
All you guys.
within that shared space, I feel like earlier I'm talking about traumas that, like, you know, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been comfortable talking about that stuff. I'm able to like bring my own person into this. And I hope that our audience feels the same way, whether they're calling into a show like this or joining our practices. This is inviting all of you, all of your first person, everything that you are as an individual is invited into this space. And I love that we can just so seamlessly move between these different persons, between these different perspectives, going from third to second to first, and then back up again, all infused and informed with this love and this blissful energy that erupts within myself anyway, whenever I feel like we're like really getting somewhere together. It's blissful.
As beautifully said, Corey.
It feels beautiful. And I'm so appreciative for you and for the show and for our connection and our relationship and friendship and for our audience. And, you know, just that after all this time, we continue to pull this thing in the same direction. And it actually feels like we're, you know, getting somewhere. And that is so tremendously rewarding for me. So I just wanted to share some of those reflections with you, Keith, and with our audience. I love you all. Beautiful said, Corey. I love you. And my love to all of you. And Corey and I will talk to you again next month when we do our next episode. That's right. That's right. Until then, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye. All right. Bye now.